All right, so this particular lecture is within the broader ambit of topic gender, and as Sir has very clearly delineated the different topics that fall within this ambit, we'll be dealing with the section C. And for this particular lecture, it will be focused on paper 2, section C, 5th, social movements in modern India, women's movements. Let's have a look at some of the PYQs on the subject. Okay. So, yeah, the first question is on the Me Too movement and its impact in India. Then in 2017, there was a question on um, despite gains from the women's movement and the state policies, gender equality is far from being achieved. Identify two major challenges that have prevented this goal from being achieved. In 2015, there was a question on the impact of post 1970 feminist movements on the Indian middle class. Then in 2014, there was a question on the main features of the second wave of women's movement. And again, there was a question on Chipko movement as an example of ecofeminism. So these have been some of the questions on women's movements. I'll have to check for 2021 and 2022 anyway. So let's begin with what we have for now. So, if we analyze the trend of PYQs between like 2020 and 2013, first of all, there have been direct questions from the 1970 feminist movements, the second wave, and Chipko as ecofeminism. Very direct questions, do not require much of an in-depth analysis, not really off the cuff. And Me Too was more of a contemporary question, and it required like an integration of whatever was in the news back then to the established sociological theories on gender, and also a way ahead. For state policy, sort of an analytical question, I would say. As a topic, I feel women's movements is quite straightforward. A general summary and an analysis of this temporal history based on sociological theories can be useful in getting an idea of this particular subtopic. So, all right. So, what I have is a very rough framework, and we'll eventually build up on it as and when we start working on it. Great. So, we'll start with summary. Look into some of the analyses and some of the thinkers who have commented on this particular topic, and then we can see if we can wrap up a way ahead. So, for introduction, I found this definition in IGNU, and I think it can be a lovely definition. So, it describes women's movements as change in institutional arrangements, values, customs, and beliefs that tend to subjugate women within the patriarchal norms of what is appropriate and what is not. So, I think this definition can be useful. Then, for understanding women's movements, it's easier to understand it in terms of a temporal summary, like how women's movements in India have changed over time, what have been the characteristics, what has been the context of women's movement in that particular era, and how it has evolved from one era to the other. So, I divided them into three phases: pre-independence, the freedom movement, and the post-independence movement. Now, pre-independence movement has two strands: reformist and revivalist. Reformist includes people like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Revivalist movement is more dependent on Arya Samaj and personalities like Dayanand Saraswati. Now, a basic difference between reformist and revivalist is reformist seeks to change the status quo, whereas revivalist movements, they tend to reinterpret the existing um, texts or the existing traditions such that they are deemed free from external corrupting influences, and in the case of India that would be the colonial influence. So the Arya Samaj talked about going back to the Vedas, a very uncorrupted form of understanding Indian society and tradition, whereas in the reformist mode you are just completely unearthing the status quo. Now, the characteristic of reformist and both reformist and revivalist movements is that they were basically male led. Of course, there was some female led resistance also, but it was few and far in between. And in the pre-independence era, the focus was basically on education, widow remarriage, abolish sati, and abolish child marriage. Pardon my handwriting, it's very rushed right now. Okay, so now, even when education was supposedly this main focus between both the reformist trends and the revivalist trends, there was a little difference. So, in Vidyasagar's and Ram Mohan Roy's conception, or even D.K. Karve's conception, education was supposed to liberate. Education was supposed to bridge this gap between the educated men and their uneducated spouses, their uneducated wives, and together this wave of education was supposed to usher in an era of social change, and you can also say, in some ways, a sense of social reasoning, social logic. Whereas in revivalism, in the Arya Samaj tradition, this education was simply a means to prepare women for housework, because their traditional space, their traditional understanding was supposed to be limited to housework, and education, even when imparted to women, was supposed to just enhance their role as a homemaker. Now, there were some female-led movements as well, and the examples for it would be Savitri Bai Phule. Then there is Tara Bai Shinde, and there is a seminal work of hers, Stri Purush Tulna, and a very scathing critique of the patriarchal attitudes that permeated the society back then. So, all in all, this was the situation pre-independence, and then we move on to women's movement during the freedom era. That again, I feel, can be divided into two aspects: Gandhian movement and the militant movement. So, with Gandhian movement, with the advent of Gandhi in the political arena, we see an enhanced role for women in the non-cooperation movement and in the civil disobedience movement. But again, Gandhian ideology is also very interesting. Even when it brought women in large numbers in the political struggle, in a socio-political struggle, the nationalist struggle, it highlighted the ideals of sacrifice, mental strength, and suffering. So, Gandhiji believed that women women had more strength for sacrifice, and they were more suited for satyagraha, because satyagraha is supposed to be a moral tool. Satyagraha requires a kind of mental strength, a sort of suffering and that attitude of non-violence and tolerance, which is more suited for women. So this is something that can be quoted, the Gandhian view. Um, and then there was the Nehruvian view as well. Nehruvian view was more inspired by the Western suffragette movements, and its focus lay more on a more nuanced idea of political equality, how the political, economic, and the social struggles were um, related together, and just like how the suffragette movement in the West equated socioeconomic liberation with the right to vote, similarly, political liberation provided a way ahead. Um, then, another important thinker that can be added here is Ambedkar, I believe. So, Ambedkar is supposed to have said that a Dalit woman is twice oppressed. First, for being a woman, first for being a Dalit, and secondly for being a woman. A very radical statement to make. And this is like even evident in Dr. Ambedkar's espousal of reforms in the Hindu Marriage Act, or like the Hindu Code Bill. So this can also be quoted as an example. Then in the militant school, would include personalities like Madam Bhikaji Kama or Captain Lakshmi Sehgal or Beena Das. So through these examples, militant school would be associated with the revolutionary trend of nationalism, and it showcased that women were not just suited for sacrifice or tolerance, they even had the capacity to take part in an all-out war and be capable for it. So these are the two. Then we move on to post-independence, and then when we are talking about post-independence, post-independence movement is basically derived, like it has certain characteristics. We are now moving towards a very constitutional legal struggle, and a lot of women's questions are packaged in terms of constitutional struggle for equality. And you can actually quote certain aspects of constitution here. So for example, article 15 clause 3, it empowers the state to make special provisions for women and children, which gives us an idea into how in general women and children are the marginalized sections or the vulnerable sections of the society. Then there is article 44 for DPSP, Uniform Civil Code, and you can link it to the ongoing debate how UCC is important, because we have personal laws that are based on certain religious dogmas that tend to be biased towards men and tend to subjugate women. All right. So, in the legislative constitutional sphere, in the 1950s, there were legal reforms for for amendments in the Hindu Code Bill, and they were basically related to marriage, inheritance, and guardianship. But an interesting point is that despite um, despite the very far-fetched and despite this very radical view of certain constitution makers, these aims could never be realized because there continue to exist a huge gap between legal and social realities in India. And this will like further translate into the Shaira Banu case and how the triple talaq bill came about to be. And it's supposedly taken a very long journey from the 1990s to 2017. This is how long it took for reformulation of these archaic personal laws. And still, I believe the Hindu Succession Act does not grant complete inheritance rights to women. There is some caveat. I might have to look into that. Please check into it maybe once. Then moving on to the idea of economic planning. So this is something very interesting that the IGNOU textbook points out, that until the sixth five-year plan, there were no women-oriented policies. It was only with the sixth five-year plan that the concern for women's economic roles was showcased. And then in the ninth five-year plan, the point for reservation for women in parliament and state legislative assemblies was made. And still, there is no provision for women's reservation in the Union Parliament. We do have the 73rd and the 74th Amendment Act that provide for women's reservation in local bodies, but none in the Union Parliament. Though some state legislative assemblies do have a provision for that. I think Bihar is one of them. So this point will sort of cover the political, economic aspect of women's movements. Then when we're talking about educational and economic status are almost sort of interrelated, and IGNOU mentions this 1974 report of the Committee on the Status of Women, and it talks about occupational biases in workplace. How in the workplace there is a tendency on the part of the employers to replace women by men or machines. And this 1974 report, it also highlighted that in general, planners, government officials, they tend to have this perspective, this middle class perception that women's primary role is that of a homemaker and not of a breadwinner. This is where comes in the class aspect. Women as a homemaker is a very urban middle class view, because for a lot of women in the rural areas, especially from low class, low caste, they have no other option but to supplement the family income, to participate in the agrarian activities. And it is when the men in rural areas migrate to urban areas in search for better life opportunities, these women are left behind to tend to an underproductive, less paid and more subject to exploitation agrarian economy. And this perpetuates a culture of feminization of poverty. There was a question based on this particular concept in the previous year questions. Meanwhile, in the economic sphere, there have been labor laws like Equal Wages Act, Equal Remuneration Act, the Maternity Benefit Act, or the provision of creche in facilities where more than 20 women employees are working. What this points to is, okay, I'm not sure about the number, maybe just check that about the Maternity Benefit Act, like how many women need to be working to have creche facilities. So these economic measures, these legislative measures, legislation, polity and economy, they're sort of interrelated. Together they have sought to provide a conducive situation for women to work, to earn. However, there is this gap. It does not really, so legislative or political or economic efforts do not translate into a social change. there is always a gap, and a part of this gap can be attributed to a host of factors. So these factors could be socialization, like we've talked about how women are supposed to be homemakers and men are supposed to be breadwinners, a very traditional feminist critique of gender roles, and some very interesting reasons that I found were given by these thinkers. One is like Ogborn and Nimkov. So they have talked about how green revolution or like land reforms, they have brought about a change in the political economic structures, but they have not been able to dismantle patriarchy. And because they have been unable to dismantle patriarchy, it leads to a cultural lag, wherein no matter how hard we work in the political and economic spheres, it does not really translate into an on ground change. Then Parsons talks about institutionalized versus internalized debate. How our institutions in general are patriarchal, like how the 1974 report pointed out that they tend to ignore women's role in the workplace. Similarly, there is an internalized aspect to it as well, wherein the individuals themselves conform to the very normative understandings of gender roles that have been assigned to them. All right. So when talking of these waves of when talking about this temporal understanding, we can also understand it in terms of the different waves of feminism. So there is the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and the fourth wave. The first wave is late 19th to early 20th century, and it sort of resonates or corresponds to the colonial era, the pre-independence era, and it's mostly related to social reform. You have people like prominent figures like Savitribai Phule, Pandita Ramabai, and the women's conferences, and then again people like Karve, Vidyasagar, and Roy. Second wave is supposed to be the period from 1960s to 1980s, which is your post-independence period. An important aspect of the second wave is that until the first wave, we were basically working in an era of social reform. Second wave marks an international collaboration. Now, what happens here is that women's movements increasingly get linked to bigger and broader international movements for gender equality, economic empowerment, reproductive rights, and also ecofeminism, environmental feminism, how women are increasingly or very intrinsically linked to the nature of their environment. So the important thinkers that you'll find here include Kamla Bhasin, Geeta Sen, and Uma Chakravarti. Whenever we are talking about ecofeminism, a very important thinker here is Vandana Shiva. And she uses a very interesting concept of Purush and Prakriti to highlight how Purush denotes order, that is culture. Prakriti is nature, associated with women. And nature, in its truest form, is about spontaneity. And that is why the masculine attempt to control, either through the formation of, like, the establishment of dams, or monoculture, or even green revolution, it's very detrimental to the spontaneity of nature, that is prakriti. And it is like, prakriti as a sphere is related to women who depend on the forests and the natural resources for food, collecting firewood, for even their economic sustenance. And when that is taken away from them in the modernizing trend of setting a certain order, it tends to harm the prakriti. This is like the basic concept, and it can then be applied to the Chipko movement or the Apiko movement, or even some of the recent environmental movements like Save the RA, RA Forest in Maharashtra. Women and students had a huge part in it. Another important person who has written on environmental feminism is Ramchandra Guha, and he looks into the politics of dams. How Nehru called dams the temples of modern India, but are they really the temples of modern India? And how displacement has a disproportionate effect on women, displacement due to these construction of dams, because their livelihood is threatened, and it might also lead to their exploitation, social as well as economic and sexual. They might be forced into exploitation, women and children too. Medha Patkar's association with Narmada Bachao Andolan can be linked to ecofeminism here. Okay, so this is like okay, international collaboration also points us to UN's declaration of 1975 as the International Decade for Women. So this is second wave is supposed to be the time wherein different regional strands are sort of merging together in an international idea of what feminism can be, collective solidarity. The idea of personal is political, and the idea of reproductive rights is very important here. There has been a PYQ on this, Leela Dubey's concept of seed and earth. How this general like, I think in all the traditional understandings of women's reproductive ability, it's related to honor, and it's regulated for the sake of purity of the clan or the lineage. And what happens is this is something that Simone de Beauvoir calls as that a woman is a victim of her own biology, that her own biological process is used to subjugate her, is used to control her choices and also her bodily autonomy. And I think a very important recent case that you can relate to it is the Roe versus Wade in US, wherein they have deemed abortion as illegal. And in India, you have the surrogacy amendment bill and all that. So that can be related to reproductive rights. Another very interesting thing here is, so this is just my analysis. You might have to look into it a bit more. If you look at all the health policies in India which are related to women, all of them are majorly and overtly focused on women's role in reproduction, their role as a mother and their journey of motherhood. So like Janani Suraksha Yojana and all these schemes, they tend to focus a lot on the reproductive aspect, but there are other health aspects as well. Of course, they're taking anemia and all into account now, but majorly India's policy focus has been reproduction and not like access to education, or access to a healthy life choices, um, or even other aspects of good health, mental health, social health, physical health, community health, that have been like majorly ignored. From the second wave, we move on to this third wave, and the third wave is your 1990s to early 2000s. Okay. A very important aspect of the third wave is intersectionality. So now you're not seeing gender in silos. Gender, it highlights that how. Okay. It highlights the third wave how gender is not in silos, and it is related to other aspects of caste, class, religion, your location, whether you are in an urban setting or you are in a rural setting, and how all these factors together influence your choices, or influence your voice, your activism, and the stance you take. So 1990 is supposed to be like this very important era, like even for India. You see the advent again of the Shaira Banu case, Vishakha guidelines, how Supreme Court had to saunter into a legislative domain because the political processes were not enough, the legislative processes were not enough to do something enough for women in the workplace, the Domestic Violence Act or the Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act. And some important thinkers from the from the third wave of feminism, you have Nivedita Menon, Nandita Das, and Shilpa Phadke. So Shilpa Phadke, she has this very interesting article, and she talks about neoliberal notions of beauty. Now understand the context here. 91, 93, India is seeing the advent of LPG reforms, and this is where our economy is shifting to a new model, and this is where our society is also shifting to a new trend of social mores and social values. And you come across this neoliberal notion of beauty, which is very specific to a certain class. Only upper class urban women can afford to look a certain way or undergo certain procedures of neoliberal beauty, or which pardon, which work according to those notions of neoliberal beauty on themselves. So this is about the third wave. Then we move on to the fourth wave. Fourth wave, very interesting. Gained currency through the digital platforms, and it's from like mid 2000s. Digital platforms brings us to how globalization and digitalization has changed this entire aspect of how women movements tend to work. An example would be like the 2017 Me Too movement. It started in US with Tarana Burke, who pointed out about the sexual harassment rampant in workplaces and even in the academic cultures in US. And from there, it spread onto different countries in different forms, led by different people. Me Too movement also has its critiques because it was basically a sort of a media trial. Media trial without, where's the evidence, and how do you prove somebody is guilty, or like, is there a legal remedy to work on a certain complaint, to pursue that complaint, or and to bring the perpetrator to justice? Is it just hue and cry? Like, this can be used as a critique, but it also had a very important role to play in terms of ushering in this conversation about making our public places more gender inclusive, not just for women but also for the LGBTQIA plus community. Then you also have the Pinjara Tod movement. It was basically across Indian universities, and it talked about curfew restrictions. It went against curfew restrictions in women's hostels. I think, like, when we're writing an answer, when we are working on this topic, we can also analytically understand that digital is just an aspect of it, and how certain events that have happened in contemporary times have influenced the trajectory of how we understand women's movements now. So, I think post 2016, the Nirbhaya case has called for an amendment in criminal laws. We are even looking at the idea of reformative and retributive justice, and how women's movement is also included. Until now, it was a very rights based issue. So far, it was very rights based, and these rights were basically in the social domain, in the political domain, and in the economic domain. Now it's also moving to an identity based issue. So we are delving into topics like sexuality or LGBTQIA plus, and like multiple identities. The thing that we talked about in case of Nivedita Menon, seeing like a feminist, and multiple identities would be that yes, you can be a woman, you could be a Dalit woman, you could be a Muslim woman, and how different identities are going to influence how you experience the social reality around you. So, and I think this is like the basic summary, I would say. I'm sorry if it's like a bit all over the place. I'm trying to, because I felt like when I was working on it, there were certain points that were always moving on to other dimensions. There always seems to be one thing leading to another, and you cannot see it as a very clear cut delineation, one thing flowing into the other. So even when I'm talking about pre-independence, independence movement, post-independence, or like the different waves, you have to remember that they do not work in isolation. They melt into one another, and you can use certain data here. When we were talking about gaps, so like in the political domain, we are talking about women's representation, and supposedly, like, the current Lok Sabha is supposed to include the maximum women representation in the recent decades. And yet, as per a recent data, I found this from PIB, in Lok Sabha, only 14.94% of the elected MPs are women. In a Rajya Sabha, it's just 14.05%. This is a very dismal state of affairs. That still, like, our elected representatives, it's just it's way less than 50% at a time when we are talking about reservation for women in legislative bodies. Similarly, all right, so I think when trying to like sum up women's movements, what we can look at is women's movements in India throughout the years and throughout the phases, they tend to have these four dimensions. And these four dimensions is something that I found from like a study by Oxford. So these four dimensions, they tend to focus on redressing disadvantage, and this disadvantage could be in any domain: educational, political, social, economic, countering stigma, dowry, against dowry, against rape, transforming social institutions. An example would be like seeking amendments to the Hindu Marriage Act or like the Hindu Code Bill. Similarly, facilitating political participation. And here we have the 73rd and the 74th Amendment Acts that make it mandatory for women's reservation in the local bodies. Some important thinkers that can be quoted here. Um, Again, I think, okay, this is something that I found in, give me a moment, please. All right, so some of the thinkers that we can look at when trying to sum up our analysis, when trying to understand or like wrap up this analysis. One would be Gail Omvet. Gail Omvet is a very important thinker every time we are talking about caste ideologies and the intersection of caste and gender. So she says that women's movements have two aspects. One is equality and one is liberation. So what happens in the equality strand is that you're looking for equality in the political, economic and the social spheres. But what happens in liberation is that you want a change in these structures. You're challenging these structures, you're dismantling these structures. Sort of a very rough understanding, but similar to the difference between the revivalist and the reform movement. Liberation tends towards reform, equality tends towards revivalism. And when talking about women's movements, how I did it, I tried to cover it temporarily, but another way to understand it could be in terms of like ecological movements, political movements, Dalit, caste-based movements, digital revolution, and digital revolution can be linked to Me Too. So I did a temporal classification, but another classification could be in terms of types. What particular issue did that phase of women's movement deal with? Another very interesting thing is, so there is this thinker A. Lingam, and the thinker A. Lingam points out how like the women's movement in India is leading towards NGOization. And these NGOs are taking up women's issues, reformulating them, repackaging them, and using them to forward the cause of women's issues. And an example would be SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association, Ella Bhatt, a very pioneering feminist leader in India. It can be related to that, for example. Then there is Veena Majumdar, and Veena Majumdar points out how majorly Indian women's movements has been accused of being middle class, and it has mostly been middle class. The marginal voices have been negated or have been downplayed. But with the advent of intersectionality, we are seeing an increased reformulation of the women's issues, and we're always seeing it in light of caste, class, and spatial location. And it is from here that we are seeing how there is increasingly this collapse of the public-private dichotomy. Like there is a questioning of the public-private dichotomy. An example would be this demand for criminalization of marital rape. So it started off as a middle class movement, has been overwhelmingly middle class, but with the advent of intersectionality, there are new avenues that are opening up, and they are questioning the public private dichotomy and bringing in the issue of a specific um, caste, class, and spatial location as dimensions. I think a very important, I think, yeah, Gail Omitz can be a very important thinker and a very important pointer to end the question with. And it can be then related to the changes that are happening in the sphere of women's issues. So I think that's it for now.